In the dim light of oil lamps flickering against marble columns, the machinery of rule once moved with the certainty of the seasons. Messengers crossed continents carrying sealed orders, tax ledgers filled with precise tallies, and soldiers stood at the edges of known maps, enforcing laws that bound strangers into a single order. Governance was not merely administration, it was the invisible architecture that turned chaos into continuity, hunger into harvest, and isolated villages into a living empire. Yet within that architecture, hairline fractures were already spreading, unseen by those who lived inside its walls. The collapse of governance structures does not announce itself with trumpets or flaming cities. It begins in the quiet places where authority first loses its grip on reality, where the distance between decree and consequence grows wider with every passing season, and where ordinary people continue their routines long after the system that sustained them has begun to hollow out from within. Daily life under a functioning system of rule possessed a rhythm so steady it became invisible. Markets opened at dawn with the same measured clamor, grain arrived from distant provinces according to schedules etched into stone, and disputes between neighbors were settled by officials whose authority no one seriously questioned. Children learned the names of distant emperors the way they learned the names of rivers. Roads were repaired, aqueducts carried water, and the threat of external raiders remained a rumor rather than a presence at the gate. People measured their lives by the reliability of these structures. A letter sent in spring would arrive before the harvest, a tax paid would guarantee protection, a law proclaimed would be enforced by men who still answered to a center. The air itself seemed ordered. Yet beneath this surface of predictability, small absences began to accumulate, delays that lengthened, shortages that recurred, officials who arrived later and left earlier, without anyone naming them as signs of something larger. The earliest warnings arrived not as crises, but as irritations that people learned to absorb. A census delayed by a season, a military unit that failed to reach its posting on time, a provincial governor who answered correspondence with vague assurances rather than concrete action. Merchants noticed that coinage felt lighter in the hand, that the metal content had been quietly reduced, yet markets still opened and trade continued. Farmers watched irrigation channels silt up, while petitions for repair sat unanswered in distant offices. The sound of administration, the scratch of stylus on tablet, the murmur of clerks, the measured footsteps of messengers, grew thinner. Those who lived closest to the centers of power sensed a growing distance between the words spoken in council chambers and the realities beyond the walls. But the machinery still turned, however more slowly, and most continued to believe that the system would correct itself as it always had. Tension rose not through sudden rupture, but through the steady erosion of trust between those who issued commands and those expected to obey them. Provincial elites began to withhold resources, claiming local emergencies that somehow never resolved. Soldiers stationed far from the capital started to negotiate their own arrangements with nearby towns, exchanging protection for food and silver when official pay arrived late or not at all. In the cities, the once reliable distribution of grain became intermittent, forcing households to stockpile and neighbors to watch one another with new suspicion. The language of governance remained formal and confident, filled with proclamations of continuity and strength, yet the gap between those words and lived experience widened. People began to speak of the center as something distant, almost abstract, a place that still existed on maps, but no longer fully existed in the daily calculations of survival. Key decisions made in the name of preservation accelerated the unraveling. Faced with shrinking revenues, authorities chose to debase the currency further, hoping to stretch limited metal into more coins. Faced with restless frontiers, they pulled seasoned troops inward, leaving outer defenses thinner. Faced with discontent among the elite, they issued sweeping amnesties and land grants that further fragmented control. Each choice seemed rational within the narrowed horizon of the moment, a necessary compromise to keep the structure standing a little longer. Yet each compromise weakened the very ligaments that held the system together. The more the center tried to assert control through emergency measures, the more it revealed how little control remained. By the time the signs became clear to those still watching closely, the capacity to reverse course had already slipped beyond reach. The system began to fail in layers rather than all at once. Tax collectors returned from the countryside with empty ledgers and stories of villages that no longer acknowledged their authority. Courts issued judgments, that no one enforced. Roads that once carried legions and merchants fell into disrepair, turning journeys that had taken days into uncertain weeks. Communication itself fractured. A message sent from the capital might take months to reach a distant province, if it arrived at all, and the reply might never return. In the silence between these broken connections, local strongmen and regional councils began to exercise powers once reserved for the center, not out of open rebellion, but out of simple necessity. The collapse did not begin with chaos, it began quietly, in the spaces where official structures no longer filled the needs they had once met. Human consequences surfaced first in the smallest units of society. Families that had planned harvests around expected grain shipments found themselves facing empty storehouses. Artisans whose workshops depended on materials arriving by official routes watched their tools fall idle. In the cities, the poor who had relied on public distributions of food faced longer lines and smaller portions, then no distributions at all. Fear moved through neighborhoods not as panic, but as a low, constant pressure. Neighbors who once shared tools now locked doors earlier, conversations that once lingered in courtyards shortened, and the ordinary sounds of evening life grew thinner. People adapted in the only ways available. Some fled toward places still rumored to have order, others turned to private arrangements with whoever could offer protection, and many simply endured, waiting for the old rhythms to return, even as evidence mounted that they would not. Social breakdown followed the failure of governance the way shadow follows the setting sun. Without reliable enforcement of contracts, trade contracted into smaller, more suspicious circles. Without consistent military presence, bands of deserters and opportunists moved along the same roads once patrolled by regular troops. Local communities that had once looked outward to a larger order began to look inward, fortifying themselves against both outsiders and the lingering claims of a distant authority that could no longer deliver. The rituals of rule, public ceremonies, formal audiences, the display of symbols of power, continued in diminished form, yet they no longer commanded the same automatic respect. What had been a shared framework of expectation dissolved into competing claims, each justified by the absence of any higher structure capable of resolving them. The long-term impact reshaped the landscape of human organization for generations. Regions that had once been tightly bound into a single administrative web fragmented into smaller units, each improvising its own rules of survival and authority. Knowledge once centralized in imperial archives scattered or vanished. Skills of large-scale coordination, how to move grain across vast distances, how to maintain complex legal codes, how to project power beyond the horizon of a single valley, faded from common practice. New forms of governance eventually emerged from the wreckage, but they rose from different foundations, built by people who no longer remembered the full complexity of what had been lost. The memory of the old system persisted in stories and ruins, a cautionary architecture of what happens when the invisible supports of order are allowed to decay beyond repair. In the years that followed the visible unraveling, survivors walked through landscapes still marked by the ambitions of the fallen structure. Aqueducts stood dry, their arches framing empty sky. Fortifications that had once marked the edge of controlled territory now served as shelters for those who had nowhere else to go. The language of the old laws lingered in fragments, quoted by those who sought to claim legitimacy in the new disorder. Yet the institutions that had given those words force no longer existed. People adapted, as people always do, constructing smaller and more immediate systems of rule from the materials at hand. Yet the scale of what had been lost remained visible in the contrast between the ruined grandeur of the past and the improvised arrangements of the present. The process of collapse revealed itself in retrospect as a sequence of thresholds crossed without fanfare. Each threshold seemed surmountable at the time: a delayed payment, a neglected repair, a compromise accepted for the sake of short-term stability. Only when enough thresholds had been passed did the cumulative weight become irreversible. Those who lived through the later stages often spoke of a strange dual awareness, the persistence of old habits of expectation, alongside the growing certainty that the world those habits belonged to was gone. The final stages were marked less by dramatic battles than by the quiet realization that no one remained who could restore what had been broken, and that the future would have to be built without the scaffolding of the past. What remains most haunting is the ordinariness with which such collapses unfold. Empires and systems of governance do not vanish in a single night of fire. They thin out across years of diminishing returns, of deferred decisions, of trust withdrawn in small increments, until nothing solid remains to withdraw from. The people who inhabit these systems rarely recognize the moment when continuity becomes memory. They continue to plant crops, raise children, and speak the language of order long after the structures that once made those acts secure have ceased to function. In the end, the collapse of governance is not merely the fall of institutions. It is the slow disappearance of the shared assumptions that once allowed strangers to live as if they belonged to a common world, assumptions that once lost can take centuries to rebuild.